This week, Congressman Louie Gohmert, along with several other GOP members of Congress, filed a lawsuit against Vice President Mike Pence, called a friendly lawsuit. They hope that the lawsuit could have the results of the 2020 presidential election overturned in favor of the president. But is there any real hope for the lawsuit to be decided on before the Electoral College vote on January 6th? Here to joining us right now to talk about the lawsuit and any updates pertaining to himself and all of the above is Texas Representative Louie Gohmert himself. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. I'm kind of curious. I don't know if you'll get a ruling, but your general position is that the vice president has a function that goes beyond being clerical and that he can make some decisions beyond that, correct?
Well, yeah, under the Constitution, he is charged with deciding to accept or not accept the electoral votes. And so that is part of his job. Now, the 1887 Electoral Count Act tries to take that away, but that would be unconstitutional, as we've tried to explain to Democrats for a number of years. Each time they've been in the majority, you can't change the Constitution with a legislative action. And that's what happened in 1887. So we're seeking a declaratory judgment that declares that the Electoral Count Act is unconstitutional in trying to tie the vice president's hands so that he can make a decision, especially, Bob, when you've got two sets of electors that have been sent by 5 states that would change the outcome of the election. The vice president has to be able to decide, do I accept these that were sent here by fraud, or do I accept these that were not sent by fraud? He needs to have that discretion. And as far as whether or not we get a ruling by the 6th, it probably would not have a chance to get to the 5th Circuit and to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the preliminary order by the judge in this case required briefing, emergency setting of briefing by today, tomorrow, the 1st. And so it looks like the judge is on course to get a hearing and make a decision before January 6th. That's the way it looks now.
Well, let me throw this at you. One of the things that I've read about the Electoral Vote Count Act is they were actually trying to keep the vice president from having too much power. And an example of that, if you bring it up to modern day, obviously this wasn't mentioned in the act back then. Back in 2001, when they met, and you had the count that went on in Florida, the vice president who was presiding was Al Gore, who lost the presidential vote. Theoretically, if he had the power you're describing, he could have said, you know what, that was fraudulent. I'm not accepting that. Now, I'm sure you've thought about this because you're all very smart, but how do you deal with that?
Well, we didn't have the kind of fraud back then that is clear now. And let me just thank Newsmax for getting out the truth. Newsmax did post an article from Bloomberg that said that all the allegations of fraud are unsubstantiated, and in talking about our lawsuit. But the truth is, with this amount of fraud, and we don't address it, say there was no Josh Hawley, say that if we don't, for whatever reason, we don't address it, and you have a corrupt election prevail, then you're not going to have another fair election. This won't happen again. But if President Trump and Vice President Pence are recognized as the winners and the fraud is recognized, then we've got a shot, and we should amend the Constitution. That's what it will take to clearly set out that the vice president has the power to not recognize when there are 2 sets of electors sent. He may select, or she may select, the electors that are legitimately sent without fraud. So we could do a constitutional amendment, but once the fraud prevails, you can bet your bottom dollar there will not be a Democrat amendment to the Constitution that will do anything to subvert what they have already accomplished with fraud.
Why do you think the court cases? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and Georgia's having a hearing now. And for those like Bloomberg that just are so ignorant they don't know whoever the writer was, he's not mentioned, the hearing in Georgia is establishing fraud. The hearings in Arizona established fraud. But they're only legislative hearing because no court in America has had an evidentiary hearing and accepted evidence on the fraud issue. So it hasn't been debunked. No court has disproven or said that is unsubstantiated because they haven't had a hearing and accepted evidence on fraud. So I just want to make that clear, Bob.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that because you haven't gotten traction with those. So essentially, if we look at January 6th, when there are objections from both sides, as we assume there will be, I mean, when I say both sides, I mean from the House and the Senate, then that's your chance to make the arguments for fraud. And you observe that argument to say, I'm not going to accept those votes.
Yes, that's exactly. I think that's a good summary.
Okay. How do you think this plays out? Is this political positioning, or do you really think you have a chance when you do the numbers? If there's a majority, I don't even know if Nancy Pelosi is going to be the speaker, but if they have a majority, is it likely you're going to get enough votes that way?
We have to do this. We have to at least try to have the fraud recognized for what it is. If we fail to do, I mean, think back to the founding when, as Dennis Miller said, the founders risk being killed or put in prison for life simply because they objected to a tax on their breakfast drink. They took the chance, and we have the greatest country, the most free country, at least it used to be, in the history of the world. We have a chance for right to prevail and the wrong to fail. And so, as Longfellow said, and we need to pursue that. We have got to pursue it. The country is at stake. Once an election is established by fraud, there's no coming back from that.
All right. Congressman Gohmert, thank you so much for joining us and shedding light. You gave a lot of information, and we appreciate it a great deal.
Thanks so much, Bob.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.